So, neurotransmitters in the autonomic nervous system, there are different autonomic neurons secrete 3 different neurotransmitters, some of which we've already talked about. Acetylcholine is one of them. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are the other 2. So those 3 are the neurotransmitters that are used by the autonomic efferent system, so sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. We talked about acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction where it's always excitatory. And remember, the effect of a neurotransmitter depends on where it binds, the receptor that it binds to. So acetylcholine, when it binds at the neuromuscular junction, it causes a muscle contraction, or the cascade effect that's going to eventually produce a muscle contraction. When it binds in the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, it's going to create different effects. So when they talk about cholinergic and androgenic neurotransmitters, it just means that's the type of cholinergic neurons produce acetylcholine. Androgenic neurons produce either norepinephrine or epinephrine. So cholinergic neurons and receptors, the neurons secrete acetylcholine, and so all preganglionic neurons in the autonomic nervous system, so that first neuron in the 2-neuron chain, all of them secrete acetylcholine. So whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, that first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, is always acetylcholine. The postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic system also use acetylcholine. So the preganglionic neuron goes to the ganglion, and the postganglionic neuron goes to the effector tissue. So in the parasympathetic branch, it's all acetylcholine. In the sympathetic branch, the preganglionic neuron uses acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neuron uses norepinephrine and epinephrine. So because the effects of the neurotransmitter depend on the type of receptors that are activated by the neurotransmitter, the androgenic receptors are in the sympathetic range. They're in the areas that are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So here's the little graphic from the book. Sympathetic, the preganglionic neuron, which is the one on the left, releases acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine or epinephrine to the effector tissues. The parasympathetic system, it's all acetylcholine. Okay, so there are 2 different groups of cholinergic receptors, and I'm not going to expect you to know all of these. I'm just acquainting you with the information. There are muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors. The nicotinic receptors are the ones that respond to nicotine as well as responding to acetylcholine. So when you smoke a cigarette or take anything that has nicotine in it, you're going to activate those receptors. But the main difference between those 2 receptors is the muscarinic receptors initiate a G protein mediated response. So that's that second messenger system that does something besides activating another neuron. So you might be changing the profile of the neuron, experiencing neuroplasticity when it binds to a muscarinic receptor. The nicotinic receptors cause a fast excitatory postsynaptic potential in the postsynaptic membrane. So the nicotinic receptors are the ones that have an immediate effect. The muscarinic receptors will have a slower but potentially longer lasting effect. So some interesting things about nicotine and its effects on the areas of the brain. I'm not going to expect you to know those, but it's there for you if you want to read them. And one thing that I thought was interesting about this is the effect of nicotine on non-smoking, on just non-smokers, it's different on men versus women. So anyway, interesting, but you don't need to know it. The anergenic neurons and receptors. So norepinephrine is the transmitter that's released by most sympathetic postganglionic neurons. The adrenal medulla is specialized to release epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the blood. So norepinephrine and epinephrine, not only are they neurotransmitters, they're also hormones. So they function by crossing the synapse and binding to the next neuron, like we've talked about before. And they also function by circulating in the blood and finding receptors. So they can have wide-ranging effects on your body, which is interesting because the sympathetic nervous system has these vast, wide-ranging effects. Receptors that bind norepinephrine or epinephrine are called anergenic receptors. Makes sense. Anergenic neurotransmitters bind to anergenic receptors. So a lot of the vasodilation and different autonomic control of the circulatory system involves anergenic receptors. And a lot of the medications that treat things like heart problems and high blood pressure have an effect on those anergenic receptors.